After 30 years of loyal service, she was fired without a second thought. But when she uncovers a huge secret about her rich boss, she does something unforgettable. The early morning sun peeked through the curtains of the Kingston mansion, casting a warm glow on the polished hardwood floors. Mrs. Eleanor Peterson, a petite woman in her early 60s with salt and pepper hair, neatly tied back in a bun, moved quietly through the halls. Her hands, weathered from years of hard work, straightened picture frames and dusted ornate vases with practiced ease. As she entered the spacious kitchen, Mrs. Peterson's lips curved into a small smile. This room had been her domain for 3 decades, a place where she had prepared countless meals and shared fleeting moments of camaraderie with the Kingston family. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson," called out a cheerful voice. 17-year-old Emily Kingston bounced into the kitchen, her school backpack slung over one shoulder. "Good morning, Miss Emily," Mrs. Peterson replied warmly. "Would you like some breakfast before you head out?" Emily nodded eagerly. "Yes, please. Your blueberry pancakes are the best." As Mrs. Peterson mixed the batter, she chatted easily with Emily about her upcoming exams and weekend plans. This was their morning ritual, a moment of connection that Mrs. Peterson cherished. "You know," Emily said between bites of pancake, "I can't imagine this house without you, Mrs. Peterson. You've been here longer than I've been alive." Mrs. Peterson chuckled softly. "Indeed, I have. I started working for your parents before they were even married. Time flies, doesn't it?" As Emily finished her breakfast and dashed off to school, Mrs. Peterson began her daily routine. She moved from room to room, dusting, vacuuming, and tidying. Each object in the house held a memory for her. The antique clock in the study that Mr. Kingston's father had given him, the delicate china set Mrs. Kingston had inherited from her grandmother, the family photos that lined the hallway, documenting the growth of the Kingston children. Around midday, Mrs. Peterson was polishing the silver in the dining room when she overheard voices coming from Mr. Kingston's study. Normally, she would have continued her work, respecting the family's privacy. But something in Mr. Kingston's tone made her pause. "We need to cut costs, Margaret," Mr. Kingston was saying, his voice uncharacteristically tense. "The company's facing some challenges." "What kind of challenges, Richard?" Mrs. Kingston asked, concern evident in her voice. There was a heavy sigh before Mr. Kingston responded. "Nothing for you to worry about. I'll handle it. But we need to tighten our belts a bit, starting at home." Mrs. Peterson's brow furrowed as she resumed her polishing, her mind racing. In all her years with the Kingstons, she had never known them to worry about money. Mr. Kingston's company, Kingston Enterprises, was one of the most successful in the city. What could have changed? As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Peterson couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She prepared dinner as usual, setting the table with care and precision. As the family gathered for their meal, she noticed the strain on Mr. Kingston's face, the worried glances Mrs. Kingston kept throwing his way. Later that evening, as Mrs. Peterson was preparing to leave for the day, Mr. Kingston approached her. His usual confident demeanor seemed subdued, and he avoided meeting her eyes directly. "Mrs. Peterson," he began, clearing his throat uncomfortably. "You've been with us for a long time, and we appreciate your service, but—" Mrs. Peterson felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen this scene play out countless times on television, but never imagined she would be on the receiving end of such a conversation. Mr. Kingston continued, his words coming out in a rush. "We're going to have to let you go. It's nothing personal, just a cost-cutting measure. We'll provide a severance package, of course." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Mrs. Peterson struggled to process his words. 30 years of loyalty and dedication, and it all came down to this moment. I understand, Mr. Kingston," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "When would you like me to leave?" "End of the week should be fine," he replied, already turning away. "HR will be in touch about the details." As Mrs. Peterson gathered her things and stepped out into the cool evening air, She felt as though she were in a dream. The familiar path from the Kingston mansion to the bus stop seemed alien and threatening. How could her life have changed so dramatically in the span of a few minutes? As the bus rumbled towards her small apartment on the outskirts of town, Mrs. Peterson's shock slowly gave way to a mix of emotions: hurt, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. For 3 decades, she had poured her heart and soul into caring for the Kingston family. She had watched their children grow, celebrated their triumphs, and comforted them in times of sorrow. And now she was being cast aside like an outdated appliance. But beneath the turmoil of her emotions, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind. Something wasn't right at the Kingston household. The overheard conversation, Mr. Kingston's uncharacteristic behavior. There was more to this story than met the eye. And Mrs. Peterson, with her years of silent observation and intimate knowledge of the family's affairs, was perhaps the only person who could unravel the mystery. The following days passed in a blur for Mrs. Peterson as she grappled with the sudden upheaval in her life. She found herself sitting in her modest apartment, surrounded by mementos from her years with the Kingstons, birthday cards from the children, a small crystal vase Mrs. Kingston had given her. One Christmas, photos from company picnics. Each item seemed to mock her current situation. As she sifted through these memories, Mrs. Peterson's resolve strengthened. She couldn't simply let 3 decades of her life be dismissed so easily. There had to be more to the story, and she was determined to uncover the truth. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Emily? It's Mrs. Peterson." "Mrs. Peterson!" Emily's voice brightened. "I've been trying to reach you. What happened? Dad won't tell us anything, and Mom just keeps saying it was a business decision. Are you okay?" Mrs. Peterson's heart warmed at the genuine concern in Emily's voice. "I'm managing, dear, but I'm worried about your family. Is everything all right at home?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. I'm not sure," Emily admitted. "Dad's been really stressed lately. He's always on the phone having hushed conversations. And last night I overheard him arguing with Uncle James about some documents." Mrs. Peterson's ears perked up at this. James Kingston was Richard's younger brother and a partner in the family business. The two had always had a cordial, if somewhat competitive, relationship. "What kind of documents, Emily?" Mrs. Peterson probed gently. "I don't know exactly," Emily replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But I heard the words audit and discrepancies. Mrs. Peterson, what's going on?" "I'm not sure, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, her mind racing. "But don't worry, I'm sure everything will be fine." After reassuring Emily and ending the call, Mrs. Peterson sat back, her brow furrowed in thought. The pieces were starting to come together, but she needed more information. The next morning, Mrs. Peterson found herself walking down the familiar street towards the Kingston mansion. As she approached, she noticed a sleek black car parked in the driveway, James Kingston's car. Taking a deep breath, she rang the doorbell. To her surprise, it was James who answered, his eyebrows rising in recognition. "Mrs. Peterson, what are you doing here?" I left some personal items behind," she improvised quickly. "I was hoping I could retrieve them." James hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Of course, come in. Richard and Margaret are out at the moment." As Mrs. Peterson entered the foyer, she couldn't help but notice the tension in James's demeanor. His usual easygoing smile was replaced by a tight-lipped expression, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. "Is everything all right, Mr. James?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture reminiscent of his brother. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Peterson. Just some business complications." As if on cue, Richard's voice boomed from the study. "James, where are those files?" James winced. "I should go." "Feel free to collect your things, Mrs. Peterson." As James disappeared into the study, Mrs. Peterson's curiosity got the better of her. she crept closer to the partially open door, straining to hear the conversation within. "We can't keep this hidden forever, Richard," James was saying, his voice urgent. "The auditors are getting suspicious. If we don't come clean now, we could both end up in prison." "Keep your voice down," Richard hissed. "We just need more time. I've already started making cuts. If we can show improved financials next quarter, we might be able to weather this storm." Mrs. Peterson's heart raced as the implications of what she was hearing sank in. Financial discrepancies, potential prison time. The Kingstons were in serious trouble. She quickly made her way to the kitchen, her mind whirling. As she pretended to gather some personal items, she noticed a stack of papers on the counter. Glancing around to ensure she was alone, she quickly leafed through them. Her eyes widened as she saw financial statements, bank records, and what appeared to be doctored invoices. Without thinking, she snapped a few quick photos with her phone before replacing the papers exactly as she had found them. As she left the Kingston mansion, her heart heavy with the weight of her discovery, Mrs. Peterson knew she had a decision to make. The information she now possessed could potentially ruin the Kingstons, the family she had served faithfully for 30 years. But it could also explain her sudden dismissal and potentially help her reclaim her dignity. Walking down the street, her mind a tumult of conflicting emotions, Mrs. Peterson realized that the next step she took would not only determine her own future, but could also have far-reaching consequences for the Kingstons and everyone connected to them. The loyal housekeeper in her wanted to protect the family, but the wronged employee demanded justice. As she reached the bus stop, she knew that whatever she decided, nothing would ever be the same again. Mrs. Peterson sat at her small kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the window, illuminating the scattered papers before her. She had spent the past few days poring over the photos she had taken at the Kingston mansion, trying to make sense of the financial jargon and complex numbers. With a heavy sigh, she reached for her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. "Hello, accounting department. This is Sarah speaking," a cheerful voice answered. "Sarah? It's Eleanor Peterson. Do you remember me?" There was a pause, then a warm laugh. "Mrs. Peterson, of course I remember you. You always brought the best cookies to the company picnics. How are you?" Mrs. Peterson smiled sadly. "I've been better, dear. Listen, I need your help with something. It's sensitive." Sarah's voice turned serious. "What's going on, Mrs. Peterson?" Over the next half hour, Mrs. Peterson explained her situation and what she had discovered. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification. "Mrs. Peterson," Sarah said finally, her voice low, "what you're describing, it's serious. If these documents are what you think they are, we're talking about major financial fraud." The words hung heavy in the air. Mrs. Peterson closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her knowledge pressing down on her. "What should I do, Sarah?" "You need to be careful," Sarah advised. "This kind of information, it could be dangerous, but it's also evidence of a crime. Have you considered going to the authorities?" Mrs. Peterson's mind raced. The authorities? The thought hadn't even occurred to her. I don't know, Sarah. The Kingstons, they're not bad people. They've just made some terrible mistakes." "I understand," Sarah said gently, "but think about all the people who could be affected by this. Employees, shareholders, clients. They deserve to know the truth." After ending the call with Sarah, Mrs. Peterson sat in silence, contemplating her next move. The right thing to do seemed clear, but the thought of betraying the family she had served for so long made her stomach churn. A knock at the door startled her out of her reverie. She opened it to find Emily Kingston standing there, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. "Emily? What are you doing here?" Mrs. Peterson asked, ushering the girl inside. Emily collapsed into a chair, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "Everything's falling apart, Mrs. Peterson. Dad's always locked in his study, Mom's pretending nothing's wrong, and I overheard them talking about selling the house. What's happening to us?" Mrs. Peterson's heart ached as she watched the young girl she had known since birth fall apart before her eyes. She placed a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "Oh, my dear, I wish I had all the answers for you." As she made Emily a cup of tea, Mrs. Peterson's resolve solidified. She couldn't stand by and watch this family destroy themselves and potentially harm others in the process. "Emily," she said softly, setting the tea down, "I need you to listen to me carefully. Your family is in trouble, but it's not too late to make things right." Emily looked up, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Peterson took a deep breath. "Your father, he's made some mistakes, serious ones. But if he comes clean now, admits to what he's done, there might be a chance to salvage something." "Mrs. Peterson, you're scaring me," Emily whispered. "I know, dear, and I'm so sorry. But sometimes the truth, as painful as it might be, is the only way forward." Over the next hour, Mrs. Peterson explained what she had discovered, careful to frame it in terms Emily could understand. She watched as the girl's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to a sad acceptance. "What are you going to do?" Emily asked finally, her voice small. Mrs. Peterson squared her shoulders. "I'm going to give your father a chance to do the right thing. But if he doesn't, I'll have to take this information to the proper authorities." Emily nodded slowly. "I understand. And I think you're right. Dad always taught us to be honest, to own up to our mistakes. He needs to follow his own advice." As Emily left, promising to talk to her father, Mrs. Peterson felt a mix of dread and determination. She knew the coming days would be difficult, potentially life-changing for everyone involved. But she also knew that the path of truth, however painful, was the only way to truly help the Kingstons and herself. She picked up her phone once more, this time dialing Mr. Kingston's number. As it rang, she steeled herself for the conversation ahead. Whatever the outcome, she was committed to seeing this through. The loyal housekeeper was gone. In her place stood a woman determined to right the wrongs she had uncovered, no matter the cost. The Kingston mansion loomed before Mrs. Peterson, its grandeur now seeming more like a facade hiding the turmoil within. She stood at the front door, her hand poised to ring the bell when it swung open. Mr. Kingston stood there, his face a mask of barely contained anger and fear. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, his voice tight, "I suppose we should talk." She nodded, following him into the study. The room, once a symbol of Mr. Kingston's success, now felt oppressive. Books and papers were strewn about, and the usually immaculate desk was a chaos of documents and coffee cups. "Emily told me you know," Mr. Kingston began, pacing behind his desk. "I don't know how you found out, but I assure you, it's not what you think." Mrs. Peterson sat straight-backed in the leather chair across from him. "Then perhaps you should explain it to me, Mr. Kingston, because what I've seen looks very much like financial fraud." He flinched at the word, then sank into his chair, suddenly looking every bit his age. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "It started small, just a few adjustments to help the company through a rough patch. But then it spiraled," Mrs. Peterson finished for him. "Mr. Kingston, I've known you for 30 years. I've watched your children grow up. I know you're not a bad man, but what you've done, it's wrong." Mr. Kingston's eyes flashed. "And what do you intend to do about it? Blackmail me? Is that why you're here?" Mrs. Peterson recoiled, hurt by the accusation. "No, Mr. Kingston, I'm here to give you a chance to make this right, to come clean before it's too late." For a moment, she saw a glimmer of the man she had known and respected for decades, but then his face hardened. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under, the responsibilities I have. I can't just throw it all away." "And what about your family?" Mrs. Peterson pressed. "What about Emily and Thomas? What will happen to them if this comes out and you haven't taken responsibility?" Mr. Kingston's resolve seemed to waver. I don't know, but I can't just give up everything I've built." Mrs. Peterson leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Kingston, Richard, listen to me. The man I've known for 30 years, the man who taught his children about integrity and honesty, he wouldn't want this. He would face the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult." A tense silence filled the room. Mrs. Peterson could almost see the internal struggle playing out on Mr. Kingston's face. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What should I do?" "Come clean," Mrs. Peterson said simply. "Go to the authorities, explain everything. It won't be easy, but it's the right thing to do. And in the long run, it will be better for everyone, including your family." Mr. Kingston nodded slowly, the weight of his decisions visible in the slump of his shoulders. I need some time to think, to talk to Margaret and the kids." "Of course," Mrs. Peterson said, standing up. "But please don't take too long. The longer this goes on, the worse it will be." As she turned to leave, Mr. Kingston called out, "Mrs. Peterson, I'm sorry for everything, especially for letting you go the way I did. You deserved better." She paused at the door, looking back at the man she had served for so long. "Thank you, Mr. Kingston. I hope you'll do the right thing." Stepping out of the mansion, Mrs. Peterson felt a mix of emotions: relief at having confronted Mr. Kingston, anxiety about what would happen next, and a strange sense of peace knowing she had done what she believed was right. As she walked down the driveway, she noticed Mrs. Kingston's car pulling up. The elegant woman stepped out, her face etched with worry. "Mrs. Peterson," she called out, "is everything all right? I saw your car and—" "Everything will be all right, Mrs. Kingston," Mrs. Peterson assured her, patting her arm gently. "Your husband needs you now. Be strong for him and for your children." Mrs. Kingston nodded, confusion and concern warring on her face as she hurried into the house. Mrs. Peterson watched her go, then turned and walked away from the Kingston mansion. She had done what she could. Now it was up to the Kingstons to face the truth and its consequences. As she drove home, Mrs. Peterson felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she knew she had acted with integrity. She had given the Kingstons a chance to make things right, to salvage what they could from the mess they had created. The future was uncertain, but for the first time since losing her job, Mrs. Peterson felt a glimmer of hope. She had stood up for what was right, had refused to be a silent bystander to wrongdoing, and in doing so, she had reclaimed a piece of herself that she hadn't even realized she had lost. The days that followed Mrs. Peterson's confrontation with Mr. Kingston were filled with a tense anticipation. She found herself constantly checking the news, half expecting to see headlines about Kingston enterprises. But as one day bled into the next, the silence became deafening. On a crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Peterson was tending to her small balcony garden when her phone rang. The caller ID displayed Emily's name. "Emily? Is everything all right?" Mrs. Peterson answered, her heart racing. "Mrs. Peterson?" Emily's voice was thick with emotion. "Dad, he did it. He went to the authorities yesterday. It's all over the news this morning." Mrs. Peterson sank into a chair, a mix of relief and sadness washing over her. "Oh, Emily, how are you holding up?" "It's been intense," Emily admitted. "Mom's devastated, Thomas is angry, and I don't know how to feel. But I think Dad did the right thing. He seems lighter, somehow, despite everything." As they talked, Mrs. Peterson's television in the background suddenly blared with a breaking news alert. She excused herself from the call and turned up the volume. Richard Kingston, CEO of Kingston Enterprises, has turned himself in to authorities, admitting to years of financial fraud and embezzlement. The company's stock has plummeted in early trading. Mrs. Peterson watched in stunned silence as the news anchor detailed the extent of Mr. Kingston's crimes. The numbers were staggering, far beyond what she had imagined. Yet amidst the shock, she felt a glimmer of pride for Mr. Kingston's courage in coming forward. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah at the accounting department. "You did the right thing, Mrs. P. It's chaos here, but at least the truth is out. As the day wore on, Mrs. Peterson's phone was inundated with calls and messages from former colleagues and friends connected to the Kingstons. Some were angry, blaming her for the company's downfall. Others were grateful, thanking her for her role in exposing the truth. In the afternoon, a knock at her door revealed a haggard-looking Mrs. Kingston. "Margaret," Mrs. Peterson gasped, ushering her inside. "I'm so sorry. How are you managing?" Mrs. Kingston's usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I don't know how to answer that, Eleanor. Our world has fallen apart. And yet, Richard says he feels at peace for the first time in years." They sat in Mrs. Peterson's small living room, the weight of recent events hanging heavily between them. "I wanted to thank you," Mrs. Kingston said softly, "for giving Richard the push he needed to do the right thing, and to apologize for how we treated you. You deserved better." Mrs. Peterson reached out and squeezed Mrs. Kingston's hand. "We all make mistakes, Margaret. What matters is how we choose to rectify them." As Mrs. Kingston left, promising to keep in touch, Mrs. Peterson felt a sense of closure beginning to form. The Kingstons' journey was far from over, but they had taken the first crucial step towards redemption. Later that evening, as Mrs. Peterson prepared a simple dinner for herself, her doorbell rang again. This time, it was James Kingston, Richard's brother, looking both troubled and determined. "Mrs. Peterson," he began, "I hope I'm not intruding. I need your help." Puzzled, she invited him in. James paced her small living room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture reminiscent of his brother. "Richard's actions have exposed more than just his own misdeeds," James explained. "There are others in the company who were involved, who are now scrambling to cover their tracks. I want to make things right, but I don't know how to proceed without implicating myself." Mrs. Peterson listened carefully, her mind racing. "Mr. James, the fact that you're here seeking advice shows that you want to do the right thing. My suggestion would be to follow your brother's example. Come clean, cooperate with the authorities. It won't be easy, but it's the honorable path." James nodded slowly, a mix of fear and resolve in his eyes. "You're right, of course. I needed to hear it from someone I trust. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, for everything." As James left, Mrs. Peterson felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders once more. She had become, quite unexpectedly, a catalyst for change, a beacon of integrity in a storm of deceit. Gazing out her window at the city lights, Mrs. Peterson reflected on the tumultuous events of the past weeks. The Kingstons' world had been shattered. Yes, but from the rubble there was a chance for something new to emerge, something built on honesty and accountability. As for herself, Mrs. Peterson realized that her journey was far from over. She had played a crucial role in bringing the truth to light, and now she felt a responsibility to see it through. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them with the same quiet strength and unwavering integrity that had guided her for the past 30 years. The aftermath of the Kingston scandal unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche over the following weeks. Mrs. Peterson watched from the sidelines as the once mighty Kingston enterprises crumbled under the weight of investigations and public scrutiny. The news was filled with reports of job losses, shareholder outrage, and the far-reaching consequences of the fraud. One crisp morning, as Mrs. Peterson sipped her tea and scanned the newspaper, her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Emily Kingston standing there, looking tired but determined. "Emily, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, ushering her in. "How are you holding up?" Emily managed a weak smile. "It's been tough, Mrs. Peterson, but that's why I'm here. I need your advice." They settled in Mrs. Peterson's small living room, the familiar space a stark contrast to the opulent Kingston mansion. "Dad's going to prison," Emily began, her voice quavering slightly. "Mom's a mess, and Thomas has buried himself in his studies. I feel like I'm the only one trying to hold our family together." Mrs. Peterson nodded sympathetically. That's a heavy burden for someone so young, Emily. I know, Emily sighed, but someone has to do it. The thing is, I've been thinking about what you did, how you stood up for what's right, even when it was difficult. And I want to do something too. Intrigued, Mrs. Peterson leaned forward. What did you have in mind? Emily's eyes lit up with a spark of the determination Mrs. Peterson had always admired in her. I want to start a support group for families affected by white-collar crime. Not just for us, but for all the employees and their families who are suffering because of what Dad did. Mrs. Peterson felt a surge of pride for the young woman before her. That's a wonderful idea, Emily. It won't be easy, but I think it could help a lot of people. Will you help me? Emily asked, hope evident in her voice. I don't know where to start, and I could really use your guidance. Without hesitation, Mrs. Peterson agreed. Over the next few hours, they brainstormed ideas, researched similar support groups, and began to outline a plan of action. As they worked, Mrs. Peterson couldn't help but marvel at Emily's resilience and compassion. Their planning session was interrupted by a phone call from Sarah at the accounting department. Mrs. Peterson, Sarah said, her voice tinged with excitement, I have some news. The new management team at Kingston Enterprises, well, what's left of it, they want to meet with you. Surprised, Mrs. Peterson asked, Meet with me? Whatever for. They didn't give me details, Sarah replied, but they seemed very keen to speak with you. I think it might be about your role in uncovering the fraud. After ending the call, Mrs. Peterson turned to Emily, who had been listening intently. What do you think it means? Emily asked. I'm not sure, Mrs. Peterson admitted, but I suppose I'll find out soon enough. The next day, Mrs. Peterson found herself back at the Kingston Enterprises building. The atmosphere was noticeably different. Gone was the bustling energy of a thriving company, replaced by a subdued tension. She was led to a conference room where 3 serious-looking individuals waited. Mrs. Peterson, the woman at the head of the table, began, I'm Amanda Chen, the interim CEO. These are my colleagues, John Reeves and Lydia Patel. We wanted to thank you personally for your role in bringing this fraud to light. Taken aback, Mrs. Peterson simply nodded. John Reeves leaned forward. Your actions, while difficult, have given us a chance to salvage what we can of the company and to make things right for our employees and shareholders. We've been impressed by your integrity and your deep knowledge of the company, Lydia Patel added, which is why we'd like to offer you a position on our ethics committee. Mrs. Peterson blinked in surprise. I'm not sure I understand. Amanda smiled. We're rebuilding this company from the ground up, Mrs. Peterson. We need people like you, people with strong moral compasses and the courage to stand up for what's right. Your experience and your integrity would be invaluable as we work to regain trust and establish new, ethical practices. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Peterson's head was spinning. She left the building with a job offer she never could have anticipated, a chance to help reshape the very company that had dismissed her. On her way home, she stopped by a small cafe to collect her thoughts. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed a familiar face at a nearby table. James Kingston, engrossed in conversation with what appeared to be a lawyer. Their eyes met briefly, and James gave her a small, grateful nod. It seemed he had taken her advice to heart and was working to make amends for his part in the scandal. As Mrs. Peterson left the cafe, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and difficult decisions, but she realized that her journey was far from over. With Emily's support group and the potential role at Kingston Enterprises, she had the opportunity to turn this painful chapter into something positive, a chance to help heal the wounds caused by the scandal and to ensure that such a thing never happened again. With a determined stride, Mrs. Peterson headed home, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had discovered a strength within herself that she never knew existed, and she was prepared to use it to make a difference. The autumn leaves were turning vibrant shades of red and gold as Mrs. Peterson made her way to the community center. It had been 2 months since she accepted the position on Kingston Enterprises' Ethics Committee, and today marked another milestone in her unexpected journey. She pushed open the door to find Emily already there, arranging chairs in a circle. The young woman's face lit up when she saw Mrs. Peterson. "You made it!" Emily exclaimed, rushing over to give her a quick hug. "I was so nervous about doing this alone." Mrs. Peterson smiled warmly. "Of course, dear. I wouldn't miss this for the world." Together, they put the finishing touches on the room, setting out name tags and a small spread of refreshments. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting time, people began to trickle in. Former employees of Kingston Enterprises, their families, and even a few faces Mrs. Peterson recognized from her years working at the mansion. Once everyone was seated, Emily cleared her throat nervously. "Welcome everyone to our first support group meeting for those affected by the Kingston Enterprises scandal. I'm Emily Kingston, and yes, I'm Richard Kingston's daughter. I know many of you may have mixed feelings about seeing me here, but I hope you'll give me a chance to explain." Mrs. Peterson watched proudly as Emily shared her story, how she had struggled with the revelation of her father's crimes, the impact it had on her family, and her desire to do something positive in the wake of the scandal. "We're all here because we've been hurt in different ways," Emily continued. "But I believe that by coming together, by sharing our experiences and supporting each other, we can start to heal." As the meeting progressed, people began to open up. A middle-aged man spoke about losing his job of 20 years and the struggle to provide for his family. A young woman shared her feelings of betrayal, having just started her career at Kingston Enterprises when the scandal broke. Mrs. Peterson listened intently, offering words of encouragement when needed. When it was her turn to speak, she took a deep breath. "Many of you know me as the housekeeper who helped uncover the fraud," she began. "But I want you to know that decision wasn't easy. I struggled with the knowledge of what it would mean for the Kingstons, for all of you. In the end, I realized that the truth, no matter how painful, was necessary for any kind of healing to begin." As the meeting drew to a close, there was a palpable sense of relief in the room. People lingered, exchanging contact information and words of support. Mrs. Peterson overheard snippets of conversation, plans to help each other find new jobs, offers to babysit for those going on interviews, suggestions for legal aid. Emily approached Mrs. Peterson, her eyes shining. "I think it went well, don't you? People seemed to really open up." Mrs. Peterson nodded, giving Emily's hand a squeeze. "You did wonderfully, dear. You should be proud of yourself." As they cleaned up the room, Mrs. Peterson's phone buzzed with a message from Amanda Chen, the interim CEO of Kingston Enterprises. "Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. Big decision to be made. Your input will be crucial." Mrs. Peterson's brow furrowed as she read the message. The Ethics Committee had been working tirelessly to implement new policies and practices, but there was still so much to be done. "Everything okay?" Emily asked, noticing Mrs. Peterson's expression. "Yes, just work," Mrs. Peterson replied with a small smile. "It seems there's never a dull moment these days." As they left the community center, they ran into Thomas Kingston, Emily's older brother. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Thomas," Emily said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture reminiscent of his father. I wanted to come to the meeting. I was just too nervous to go inside." Mrs. Peterson's heart went out to the young man. "It's okay, Thomas. These things take time. Perhaps you'll feel ready for the next one." Thomas nodded, looking grateful for the understanding. "Maybe. I wanted to say thank you to both of you for doing this, for trying to make things right." As they parted ways, Mrs. Peterson couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but seeing the Kingston siblings taking steps to address the harm caused by their father's actions was encouraging. Walking home in the crisp evening air, Mrs. Peterson reflected on the twists and turns her life had taken. From a loyal housekeeper to a whistleblower, and now a member of an ethics committee and a support group facilitator, each role had challenged her in ways she never expected. But as she thought about the people she had met today, the lives touched, and the small steps towards healing that had been taken, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The future was still uncertain, but Mrs. Peterson was ready to face it with the same quiet strength and unwavering integrity that had guided her this far. The next morning, Mrs. Peterson arrived at Kingston Enterprises, her mind still processing the events of the previous evening's support group meeting. The office buzzed with a nervous energy as she made her way to the conference room. Amanda Chen, the interim CEO, greeted her with a tense smile. "Mrs. Peterson, thank you for coming. We have a significant decision to make today." As the other members of the ethics committee filed in, Mrs. Peterson noticed the grave expressions on their faces. Once everyone was seated, Amanda began. "As you all know, we've been working tirelessly to rebuild this company's reputation and implement ethical practices. However, we've hit a roadblock." She paused, taking a deep breath. "We've uncovered evidence of further misconduct that predates Mr. Kingston's tenure as CEO." A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Peterson leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "What kind of misconduct?" Amanda explained that they had discovered a series of questionable contracts and partnerships dating back nearly 2 decades. While not illegal, these arrangements skirted ethical boundaries and had contributed to the culture that allowed Mr. Kingston's fraud to flourish. "Our dilemma," Amanda continued, "is whether to disclose this information publicly. On one hand, it could further damage our already fragile reputation. On the other, full transparency might be the only way to truly start fresh." The room erupted into debate. Some argued for discretion, fearing the company couldn't survive another scandal. Others pushed for complete honesty, regardless of the consequences. Mrs. Peterson listened intently, weighing each argument. When the room finally fell silent, all eyes turned to her. "Mrs. Peterson," Amanda said, "given your unique perspective and your role in bringing the initial fraud to light, we'd particularly value your input on this matter." Mrs. Peterson took a moment to gather her thoughts. "When I first discovered Mr. Kingston's fraud, I was torn. I had loyalties to the family, to the company, to my fellow employees. But in the end, I realized that the truth, however painful, was the only path forward." She looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. "We have an opportunity here. Yes, disclosing this information may hurt us in the short term, but it's also a chance to show that we're truly committed to change, that we're willing to face our past mistakes head-on and do better." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Amanda nodded slowly. "You're right, Mrs. Peterson. We can't build a new foundation on old secrets. We'll draft a public statement immediately." As the meeting adjourned, Mrs. Peterson felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She knew the coming days would be challenging, but she also felt a sense of pride in the company's decision to prioritize ethics over expedience. Later that afternoon, as Mrs. Peterson was leaving the office, she bumped into Sarah from accounting. "Mrs. Peterson," Sarah exclaimed, "I heard about the meeting. Word travels fast around here. I just wanted to say, I think you made the right call." Mrs. Peterson smiled warmly. "Thank you, Sarah. I hope it's a step in the right direction for all of us." As they chatted, Mrs. Peterson noticed a group of employees huddled around a computer, looks of concern on their faces. Sarah followed her gaze and sighed. "They're probably reading about the latest layoffs. It's been tough, you know? Even with the new management trying to do right, we're still feeling the effects of everything that happened." Mrs. Peterson's heart sank. Despite the progress they were making, the human cost of the scandal was still painfully evident. An idea began to form in her mind. "Sarah," she said slowly, "what would you think about starting a mentorship program? Something to help employees who've been affected by the layoffs find new opportunities, either here or elsewhere." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant. We could use our network, offer resume workshops, maybe even partner with other companies for job placements." Energized by the idea, Mrs. Peterson and Sarah spent the next hour outlining a plan. By the time they parted ways, they had the beginnings of a program that could offer real help to those struggling in the wake of the scandal. As Mrs. Peterson headed home, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The day had been a roller coaster of emotions, from the tense decision-making of the morning to the hopeful planning of the afternoon. She realized that this was the new normal for her, a life filled with challenges, but also opportunities to make a real difference. Passing by a small park, Mrs. Peterson decided to take a moment for herself. She sat on a bench, watching as the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. She thought about how much her life had changed in the past few months, from a housekeeper taken for granted to a respected voice in a company's ethical rebirth. As she sat there, Mrs. Peterson made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to face each challenge with the same integrity and compassion that had guided her this far. The road ahead might be uncertain, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time, helping to rebuild not just a company, but the lives of all those affected by its past mistakes. The crisp autumn air had given way to the first chill of winter as Mrs. Peterson made her way to the courthouse. It had been 6 months since the Kingston scandal broke, and today marked a significant milestone: Mr. Kingston's sentencing hearing. As she climbed the courthouse steps, she spotted Emily and Thomas huddled together, their faces a mixture of anxiety and resignation. Mrs. Peterson's heart went out to them. "Mrs. Peterson," Emily called out, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm so glad you're here." Thomas nodded in agreement. We could use your support today." Mrs. Peterson gave them each a reassuring squeeze on the arm. "Of course, dears. I wouldn't be anywhere else." As they entered the courtroom, Mrs. Peterson was struck by the somber atmosphere. She saw familiar faces from Kingston Enterprises, members of the press, and even some participants from the support group she and Emily had started. The proceedings began, and Mrs. Peterson listened intently as the judge recounted the details of Mr. Kingston's crimes. It was strange to hear it all laid out so clinically: the numbers, the dates, the laws broken. It seemed at once both more and less real than the tumultuous months she had lived through. When it came time for character statements, Mrs. Peterson was surprised to hear her name called. She hadn't prepared anything, but as she made her way to the front of the courtroom, she knew exactly what she needed to say. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I worked for the Kingston family for 30 years. I saw Mr. Kingston at his best, and ultimately, at his worst. What he did was wrong, there's no question about that. But I've also seen the impact of his actions on his family, on the employees of Kingston Enterprises, and on the community at large." She paused, looking directly at Mr. Kingston. "In the months since this scandal came to light, I've witnessed something remarkable. I've seen people come together to support one another. I've seen Mr. Kingston's children work tirelessly to make amends for their father's actions. And I've seen a company commit to real, meaningful change." Mrs. Peterson turned back to the judge. "I'm not here to excuse Mr. Kingston's actions, but to ask that in your sentencing, you consider the possibility of redemption. The harm he's caused is significant, but so too is the potential for healing and growth that has emerged in the wake of this scandal." As she returned to her seat, Mrs. Peterson caught Mr. Kingston's eye. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she had known for 3 decades, remorseful, humbled, but with a glimmer of hope. The judge's voice rang out, announcing the sentence. Mrs. Peterson held Emily's hand tightly as they listened to the terms: prison time, fines, community service. It was a hefty punishment, but not as severe as it could have been. As the courtroom began to clear, Mrs. Peterson found herself face to face with Mrs. Kingston. "Eleanor," Mrs. Kingston said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for everything. Your words today, they meant more than you know." Mrs. Peterson nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. "We've all been through so much, Margaret. Now it's time to focus on healing and moving forward." Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Mrs. Peterson watched as Emily and Thomas bravely faced the cameras, speaking about their father's actions, their family's commitment to making amends, and their ongoing efforts to support those affected by the scandal. As the day wound down, Mrs. Peterson found herself back at her small apartment, reflecting on the journey of the past 6 months. She thought about the ethics committee at Kingston Enterprises, now working on implementing industry-leading transparency measures. She thought about the support group, which had grown and evolved, becoming a beacon of hope for many. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. Mentorship program officially approved by the board. We start next month. Couldn't have done it without you, Mrs. P! Exclamation mark. A smile played on Mrs. Peterson's lips. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, helping to launch the mentorship program, continuing her work with the ethics committee, supporting the Kingston children as they navigated their new reality. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. She had helped bring the truth to light, and in doing so, had set in motion a series of events that were slowly but surely bringing about positive change. As she prepared for bed, Mrs. Peterson realized that her journey was far from over. The scandal that had upended her life had also opened up new paths, new opportunities to make a difference. And she was ready to embrace whatever came next, armed with the wisdom of her experiences and the unwavering integrity that had guided her this far. 1 year had passed since the Kingston scandal first broke, and Mrs. Peterson found herself standing at the podium of a packed auditorium. The occasion was the first annual Ethics in Business Conference, organized by the reformed Kingston Enterprises. A year ago, Mrs. Peterson began, her voice steady and clear. I was a housekeeper who stumbled upon a truth that would change many lives, including my own. Today, I stand before you, not as a whistleblower or a victim, but as someone who has witnessed the power of integrity, accountability, and community. She went on to describe the journey of the past year, the challenges faced, the lessons learned, and the unexpected opportunities that had arisen from the ashes of scandal. As she spoke, she saw familiar faces in the audience. Emily and Thomas Kingston, sitting proudly in the front row, Sarah from accounting, now heading the successful mentorship program, and even Mr. James Kingston, who had served his own shortened sentence and was now working with anti-corruption initiatives. The road to redemption is never easy, Mrs. Peterson continued, but it is always worthwhile. Kingston Enterprises has become a model for corporate reform, setting new standards for transparency and ethical practices in the business world. She spoke of the support group, which had evolved into a nonprofit organization, helping families affected by white-collar crime across the country. She mentioned the mentorship program, which had already helped dozens of former employees find new careers or start their own businesses. As she concluded her speech, Mrs. Peterson shared a final thought. The greatest lesson I've learned is this. Integrity is not just about making the right choice in big moments, but about living with honesty and compassion every day. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and being willing to learn and grow from our mistakes. The applause that followed was thunderous. As Mrs. Peterson stepped down from the podium, she was engulfed in a sea of handshakes and heartfelt thanks. Emily and Thomas rushed to embrace her, their eyes shining with gratitude and admiration. Later that evening, as the conference wound down, Mrs. Peterson found a quiet moment to herself. She thought about Mr. Kingston, still serving his sentence, but working on rehabilitation programs for white-collar offenders. She thought about Mrs. Kingston, who had found purpose in advocating for financial literacy education in schools. Her phone buzzed with a message from Amanda Chen, now the permanent CEO of Kingston Enterprises. Your speech was inspiring, Eleanor. The board has unanimously voted to establish the Eleanor Peterson Scholarship for Ethics in Business. We hope you'll chair the selection committee. A warm smile spread across Mrs. Peterson's face. From a housekeeper taken for granted to a respected voice in business ethics, it had been an unexpected journey, but one she wouldn't change for the world. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Peterson caught sight of her reflection in a window. The woman looking back at her stood taller, her eyes bright with purpose. She had faced challenges, made difficult decisions, and emerged stronger for it all. Walking out into the cool evening air, Mrs. Peterson felt a sense of contentment wash over her. The scandal that had once seemed like the end of everything had become a catalyst for positive change, touching more lives than she could have ever imagined. As she hailed a taxi, Mrs. Peterson looked forward to the future with optimism. There would always be new challenges to face, new wrongs to right. But armed with her unwavering integrity and the support of the community she had helped build, she was ready for whatever lay ahead. The journey, she realized, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.